Mm. Hello, everyone tuning in. We will be starting in just a few minutes. Okay. Are you ready to start, Magama?
I'm good.
Right. Okay. Hello and welcome to everybody who's tuning in. My name is Abir, and I'm an intern at Africa for Palestine. For those of you who don't know about us, we focus on strengthening African-Palestinian relations and pushing back against apartheid Israel's infiltration and influence into the continent of Africa. We work with solidarity groups, trade unions, political formations, and human rights organizations across the African continent who have our same spirit of progressive internationalism and a commitment to standing with the oppressed peoples around the world. This is one of the many talks that we'll be hosting on our online platform. We can connect and discuss with all of you to discuss important topics that are relevant to our organization and our work. So today we're having a talk called Post COVID-19, the End of US Hegemony. And it's a question. And we have with us Hargreaves Magama, Comrade Magama, who will be discussing this with us. So just to let you all know a little bit about Comrade Magama, in 2009, he was elected as a member of parliament for the ANC and served on the portfolio committees on public work and international relations and cooperation. He later served as chairperson of the South African Parliament's International Relations Portfolio Committee until 2014. Magama is a board member of Africa for Palestine. So welcome, Magama. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much, Abir, and hello to all the viewers and listeners.
Oh, thank you. We're very happy to have you discuss this topic with us. I think it's a really, interesting time that we're in right now because, I mean, it's an unprecedented, event that's happening all around the world. And there's no doubt that there's going to be a massive change within power, within economies due to COVID-19. And so I'm really interested to hear your reflections on how this is going to affect the world, but also specifically talking about the US empire and the possible power shift that's going to occur due to COVID-19.
No, absolutely. It's a very interesting time indeed. For perhaps another reason, it has never been in the world that there was a sole superpower, what we call a hegemony. And so the situation with the United States is quite an interesting development in international relations. That of course pretty much required most countries in the world to really rethink, and reposition themselves in international relations. But Comrade Kabir, let me start perhaps first by, giving a shout out to all oppressed peoples of the world. in particular our comrades, friends, brothers, and sisters in Palestine, who, as the rest of us, are hunkering down, trying to deal with the fallout from COVID-19. They are perhaps facing the most brutal stage in the occupation,
Yes.
where Palestinian health workers, are even, prohibited by the apartheid Israeli forces from doing the elementary work, of conducting testing and treatment of Palestinians under occupation. I mean, we have seen quite a dramatic increase in the wanton murders of Palestinian children, women, and the aged. I mean, the Israeli regime, like indeed the vulture that it is indeed exploiting COVID-19 to
Yes.
step up the destruction of Palestinian homes, including burning them to the ground. I mean, this is the kind of inhumanity that is really, beyond words, and perhaps most despicable, especially under these very difficult and challenging times of COVID-19. Let me extend our salutations to the people of Venezuela, who themselves being strangulated under U.S. sanctions. And of course, the imperial powers, just as we've seen 3 days ago, sent 4 warships to Venezuela, ostensibly to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from providing, the Venezuelans with oil, fuel, to help them through these difficult times. Iran itself, as we know, is also being strangulated by murderers. I mean, these are genocidal sanctions against Venezuela, against Cuba, against Iran, that are really aimed at, really forcing, I mean, essentially killing babies and women and children, the most vulnerable in society, who are now unable even to access medicines. I mean, this is despicable. And what is even worse is the quietness. I mean, the quietness is so unbelievable from the international community, especially during this difficult time for the rest of us. I mean, if we in countries like South Africa and Zimbabwe and Namibia and others are finding it so difficult in dealing with the fallout from COVID-19, what about countries, like Venezuela and Iran, who are really deliberately being prevented from accessing medicines? But having said that, I think the Cuban people and their government have once more shown to the rest of the world, at least to the Western world, what true humanism, can do, what is possible when we merely see each other as humans, and we act in a spirit of international solidarity. And we on our side, as the Global South, are not surprised, because Cubans have been assisting developing, especially the Global South, for years. I mean, in South Africa, for instance, at the onset of our democracy in 1994, we received Cuban assistance. They sent here something like 5,000 doctors to come and assist the new South Africa. Those doctors had no complaints. They went to our rural areas, to go and assist people. So salute to the people of Cuba and their government. But they are the example of true human solidarity. And they are indeed the bearers of what is true. I mean, what is possible when, a people come together. And so really, we want to give a shout out to all those people and tell them, perhaps remind them of what Agostino Neto said, that no regime can press over the hot lid of a boiling pot forever. And it is true for every struggle, that humankind has ever undertaken.
Yes. No, thank you for those words. I mean, it's really important to talk about Iran and Venezuela and Cuba and all of these countries in Palestine, all of these places that are experiencing COVID-19, but even in a worse way because of these sanctions, these occupations that they are dealing with. But speaking of regimes, your last quote, I think that takes us right to our topic. So we're talking about US hegemony and what's going to happen with US hegemony now under COVID-19. So before we kind of start talking about the shifts or what you think will happen, just can you give us a brief overview of the rise of the US as a global power?
No, thank you. I think, suffice it to say that the US, as we know it today, is practically unrecognizable from the country, that it was. And we may venture to say what the early settlers even imagined it to be. Nevertheless, Abdir, as a country that was founded on the wholesale slaughter and expulsion of indigenous Americans, the Indians, American Indians as we know them, it was a slaughter that was predicated on what was called manifest destiny. And so, in that context, American expansionism was always a foregone conclusion. Now, perhaps I should just, as background, perhaps just lay out the three elements of what a manifest destiny really, because this was a deeply held cultural belief, and it still is largely within the American body politic, and especially the ruling elites. Now, manifest destiny has three basic elements. The one is, the special virtue of the American people and their institutions. The second one was what they regard as the mission of the United States to redeem and remake the West, and of course the world in the image of America. And then of course the third element of it is the irresistible destiny to accomplish this essential duty. Yes. Now it's important to understand that because you can then now begin to see that America's regime change wars throughout the years, falls, within that mindset. Now, perhaps America, since its own independence, was pretty much a regional power. And so, but if there is a single moment in which, America became a global power, a global player, it was really with the war with Spain in 1898. The war ended with the US taking three Spanish possessions. The one was the Philippines, the other one was Puerto Rico, and the other one, Guam. Over the next 2 years, the US would annex the Kingdom of Hawaii, Samoa, the Wake Islands, and of course, subsequently sent its troops to occupy the Panama Canal Zone and indeed the Dominican Republic. So what this meant in geopolitical terms for the US at the time, number one, for the very first time in its history, the US made a major strategic commitment in the Far East, that is now in the Philippines in particular. Secondly, it acquired territory never intended for statehood. You would see that in Guam, Hawaii, and so on and so on. And then, of course, it then, with that, committed itself to police actions and, of course, intervention in the Caribbean and Central America. So that was the defining moment, what really began to define the United States. And from then on, for all its denial then and since, the US, had rather become a European-style imperial power with territories outside of the United States itself. And so, not unlike, of course, its European partners, now America was also using its influence, increasing its military spending and covert actions that were very brutal to protect and advance what was now becoming a growing influence and commercial interests, abroad. Part of that, of course, meant that it now had to install pro-American regimes in countries like, Nicaragua, as you would recall. And from then on, the US started playing a major role in international diplomacy. Now, I think perhaps two other events that I think crucial in also understanding. Notwithstanding, World War I was another catalyst because the US initially didn't join World War I. It declared its neutrality, later joins the war after almost 3 years or so on the side of the Allied powers. And once the US joined, it tilted the balance of forces in favor of the Allied powers against then Imperial Germany. And then they won the war in 18 months. But now from that point on, the US had now gained stature as a military, industrial, and an economic giant through its war industrial, output. The other catalyst was perhaps in more recent times, was the breakout of the Second World War. Germany and Italy, Japan are defeated in that war. The human and economic devastation of World War II, of course, also followed by independence struggles in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, from
Yes.
the grip of colonial imperial powers at the time, your France, UK, Portugal, Spain, and so on. The US emerges, much stronger out of the Second World War. But in that, the US doesn't emerge alone, it emerges with another competitor, the Soviet Union. Now, but subsequently, the US then implements, you would recall, the Marshall Plan. It was a program to the tune of something like $15 billion. In today's money, I've made some calculations, it would amount to something like $100 billion today, with a view to helping the reconstruction of Europe, but also at the same time creating a market for US products. And so essentially how this works, the US would provide the money to these European countries. They would then buy the goods from the US, and the US would use US merchant ships, to transport the goods all across the Atlantic to Europe. And so the US was then able to make sure that on the one hand, it gives the assistance, but on the other, its own companies profited from the Marshall Plan. So secondly, what the US then does is it reorganizes the global economy away from the pound, which was, of course, the currency used in international trade, but also away from the gold standard and moves it to the dollar. Today, we refer to that process as the dollarization of the global economy. And then, of course, the last nail in the coffin is that the US sets up the Bretton Woods institutions, and out of that emerges what we today know as the global financial system, with the United States at its very center.
Yes.
And so, lastly, on that, what then happens simultaneously is, Asia and Latin America and Africa are beginning to become independent. The US, on the other hand, supports, the European colonizers, while conversely, the Soviet Socialist Republic at the time supports our independence struggles. And then subsequently, after this independence, leadership came into play, came into power, the US then starts playing a central role in toppling post-independent governments through coups and assassinations of leaders and regime change through covert means and so on. And then it also then subsequently installs, it arms and trains and finances these puppet regimes and the dictators across the world.
Yes.
So what that did is, of course, it put the US in a very unique situation in this global power competition between themselves and the Soviet Union. Now, critically to understand is another milestone in the process, and that is the fall of the Soviet Union. Starting around 1989, finalized officially in 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union, elevates the United States as the global hegemon. It ushers in a new era of Western triumphalism. This is then followed subsequently about another reordering of the global economy. And then emerges the neoliberal global economic order.
Yes.
The US engages in military adventurism subsequently in Europe, in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And at this point, the US is now overextended. Today, the US has over 800 military bases around the world. It has financial and security commitments all over the globe. Now, at the point of the collapse of the Soviet Union, what is interesting, Abir, is that the US could have chosen, now that its main competitor was no more, it could have chosen not to expand.
Yes.
But it did.
Okay. And now I wanna ask you a little bit about that. So just to go over some of the points that you mentioned, the rise of the US comes post the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, starts to build economic power after these global shifts of national power, right? So now it's in a position of national power. It's building economic power. Then you have the fall of the Soviet Union and this rise of neoliberalism. And then you were talking a little bit as you were explaining that how the U.S. intervened and with its foreign policy into other countries. So let's talk about this rise of militarization of the US and rise of foreign policy and intervention of the US.
Look, one of the consequences of the rise of the US, firstly, both as a global player, and then later, as a global hegemon, as a global superpower, and the only superpower for that matter, was that it put the US in the invidious position, where it made policy choices that, number one, put the US in a perpetual state of war. I mean, let me just give you an idea of the scope and scale of this war mentality, and of course the policy choices. And I must add that this wasn't inevitable. As I said when I ended, the brief historical overview, I said the US could have chosen,
Yes.
but it made policy choices, which then brought it, number one, in this perpetual state of war. Now, the US fought about 31 wars since World War II to the end of the 20th century. That is now ranging from Korea in 1950 to what was called Operation Infinite Reach in 1998 in Afghanistan. Right? Now, since then, since the start of the 21st century, the US fought about 12 or maybe 13 wars, depending on how you count them, right? Since the start of this century, starting in Afghanistan again in 2001, and ending in Yemen, the ongoing war in Yemen. Well, both of them, Afghanistan and Yemen, are still ongoing wars, right? But now, what is even more is what is little talked about, and I hope this will give our viewers a sense of the scope and scale. This doesn't include at least 72 known regime change operations during the Cold War. It doesn't include 15 known regime change operations, and of course, countless covert actions in the post-Cold War period. This includes regime change operations in Nicaragua, in Brazil, in Iran, in Venezuela, Ecuador, and so on. Doesn't include the continuing drone wars that the US is fighting in Pakistan, in Niger, in Somalia, in the DRC, and elsewhere. It doesn't include the economic wars against Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and indeed China. It doesn't include the 14 territories under US rule, most of whom have populations who have no right to vote in US elections. So it doesn't include those. And indeed, suffice it to say, perhaps also at this point, that other, of course, covert actions, we will probably only get to know much later about them.
Yes,
but that is a consequence. That is one of the consequences of the rise of the US, as a global superpower. Now, perhaps let me quickly deal with another consequence. All these things put together, I mean, the 800 military bases and everything else that I've just counted, have left the US in the unenviable position of having unprecedented budget deficits. I mean, the US, for instance, spends about $705 billion just on military spending for the year 2020 to 2021. I've checked this, 2 days ago or so. This accounts for about 37% roughly of all global military spending. All of it, 37%, right? The federal budget of this year, 2020, is almost 4 trillion. a deficit. I mean, that's a budget deficit of $4 trillion, right? And indeed, the US, only for this year alone, they are running a deficit that that exceeds about 102% for this fiscal year alone.
Mm.
Now, you look at the US Treasury official figures for the debt of the US government by 30 April this year. It's about 25 trillion and counting, I must add. If you take into account, that these economic assistance packages or bailouts that the Trump administration is currently undertaking, the houses, or at least Congress, is also looking at other bailout measures. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, this is absolutely incredible. So now it is inevitable that this would have led, and it should have been foreseen by the US leadership, that it would lead to a long-term economic decline. And indeed, the US is in a long-term economic decline. In part, of course, the policy choices they made. For instance, they are reordering and the global neoliberal economic order. This, in the US, for instance, alone, resulted in the erosion of the manufacturing base. We know in areas what is called the Rust Belt in the US, Michigan and Detroit. I mean, the vehicle manufacturing companies and other companies have left. They've set up shop in China and Bangladesh and Mexico and in other countries. But the result is that you have something like 55,000 US companies that left the US and set up shop in developing countries. The result, of course, was massive job losses. I mean, in the first decade of this policy, they lost about 6 million jobs. And so you then had an explosion of unsustainable levels of income inequality in the US.
Yes.
And so what you are seeing really is the decline of the superpower. Now, another consequence, and perhaps let me talk to the last consequence, is that as we speak, the US is currently torn apart by domestic centrifugal forces, that manifest themselves, on matters of race, on matters of economic equality, on police brutality, the political tribalism that you find, currently playing itself out. I mean, what I refer to as tribal wars between the Democratic and Republican parties. The emergence of a police state, of a surveillance state, the militarization of civil institutions. I mean, U.S. police, is no secret, has been militarized, and so the U.S. has constructed a police state for all practical intents and purposes. And so currently, the U.S. is being torn apart by these centrifugal forces, and so it clearly tells us that this superpower that we know, the global hegemon, is indeed in decline.
Yes. I mean, that's a really great setup. You mentioned this rise of military power, but also military spending that's putting the US into debt, and the inequalities that are happening, the vast inequalities that are happening in the country because of the debt that they're putting, the spending of the country, and then lastly, like the domestic forces, the injustice, the oppression, poor people, racial injustice, et cetera, and the rise of this police state for the US. And this is really a great setup because right now, when we're looking at the US under COVID-19, in these past few months, the US has the highest number of cases. I think it's over 1.5 million cases of people who've had COVID-19, almost 100,000 deaths that are resulting from COVID-19. And it's I mean, looked at by the rest of the world as a disaster, this complete mismanagement of this crisis. And I think all of that is kind of just a ramification of what the US represents and how they've decided to, where they invest their priorities in policy, in money, etc. And so I really want you to kind of let's shift to now, this recent, these recent past few months. I want you to talk about what are the implications and the impacts of COVID-19 on the US economy as it's facing this decline.
Of course, what you see is, as you correctly pointed out, it's about 1.5 million people infected, about almost 100,000 dead. These quarantines and lockdowns have obviously frozen the US economy. I mean, if you look at the US stock market, about 3 days ago, it had lost about a quarter of its value. Just last week, you would have seen in the news that about 30 million Americans applied for unemployment benefits. I mean, that's the highest in US history, even worse than the Great Depression, in the start of the 1900s. And so you look at the US's, key economic indicators. I mean, you take consumption, which makes up about 70% of the US GDP, right? Consumption is, it's almost at a zero, because obviously families are not spending money on major purchases. They worry about their finances because many of them are facing the prospect of losing their jobs. So people are in a saving mode. You look at investments, they are about 20% of US GDP. These are off because investors are waiting for clarity on COVID-19. You look at manufacturing, roughly about 11.4% or so of US GDP. This has been disrupted because, the global supply chains have been disrupted. Nothing is really happening. And of course, factories are closed all over the world. Ford and GM, for instance, have been closed now for a number of months. You look at entertainment, and the recreational industry and so on. They are about just over 4% of US GDP. Well, who's going to restaurants in the US? And so that number is zero. So all these point to one thing, that the US economy, and of course by extension, the global economy is almost certainly, facing a recession. And so you take that and you add that to all this other spending, US deficit. There was the famous phrase that Obama used, that was now just before he became president, before his tune changed, of course. Was that President Bush put the Iraq and Afghanistan wars on a credit card, and we know that he was
going to continue in the same way.
Exactly the same, and so that's where the US is, and so any rational person would have reached the conclusion that the US was really tying itself up. And of course, is responsible for its own decline. And so, but perhaps, what does it mean for us? How do we see this playing itself out?
Yes.
Line.
I think that.
Sorry.
No, I think that's a great kind of point of continuation.
Yeah.
So now that it's in decline, what does that mean for the rest of the world? What are the implications internationally for all of this?
I believe we have already started seeing the implications for the rest of the world. You see a more aggressive US in international relations. You see an aggressive unilateralism, in global governance matters, for instance, where the US simply, shows complete disregard for the United Nations and any other institution that they don't exclusively control anymore. Because also, you see, there's another factor. We haven't spoken about the other side of the ledger. And perhaps it's a good time to put this across. You see, on the other side of the ledger, you have the rise of China, in particular, which by all estimates will overtake the US economy in the next 25 years. You have the rise of China also militarily. Now, what that does, and of course, let me link that to Russia. What the US successfully did really was to push Russia and China closer together, closer than they were initially. Because remember, they are neighbors, they've had disputes, territorial disputes about borders and other stuff in the past. The US succeeded in really building a united front between those two powers. Now, of course, Russia, coming from the Cold War, has now also, begun to assert its own interests. And you can see that clearly in Syria.
Yes.
The Russians, where they've simply drawn the line to say, look, the rest of us also have interests. You see what happened in Ukraine, in the Donbass. Russia is asserting its interests. China is asserting its interests, has gained confidence as well. And they are asserting their own interests, especially in the South China Sea. They are saying to the US, look, we also have interests. Your interests are not the only interests in the world. And so what you see, the reaction of the US is then this, crass, aggressive unilateralism in matters of global governance. You see a much more aggressive militarization of US foreign policy. We've seen the weaponization of the dollar in international relations. We've seen sanctions that has now become a central tool, a central instrument of US foreign policy. We've seen the tariff war with China, the countless numbers of sanctions against Russia and everybody else. We've seen the erosion of the US influence in global multilateral forums. And as a consequence, what you've seen the US doing is staging walkouts from UN bodies, from UNESCO, from the UN Human Rights Council, and there are indications that they are actually talking about possibly withdrawing from the WTO. You've seen them withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. And so now more and more the US is relying on coercion, on intimidation, bribery, again, also as central instruments of US foreign policy.
Okay. Well, that's I think that's a really good overview of what's been happening. I mean, we can all see this. I think the defunding of the World Health Organization by the US, et cetera, walking out of the UN meetings, like you said, anything that they're losing control over, they're kind of, they're getting very aggressive towards all of these international bodies, as with the rise of other superpowers. So this is, I think we have to, we're going to wrap up soon. This is kind of my last question for you. What do you think the future looks like, a multipolar world, possibly, due to the power shifts coming out of this decline of the US that has been happening, but now is being exacerbated by COVID-19?
I briefly want to talk about this issue on two levels. The one is the domestic factors within the US itself. I mean, what we have seen is there is a post-Iraq war collapse of the internal imperialist consensus. So the US is now, actively being challenged by its own citizens, about their imperialist designs. There are internal challenges to the police surveillance state. There is clearly a waning of Western mainstream media influence in the US body politic. And it is more and more being replaced by the emergence of alternative media. And so what you've also then seen, at least in the past 5 years, 6 years or so, is the resurgence of left-wing progressivism, which has been dead for all practical intent since, almost 8 years ago, since the advent of McCarthyism. And so there are a number of opportunities that then arises as a result. I think for the first time, it is now possible for us, for the progressive left in the world to begin to truly build a global left progressive, post-Cold War agenda. That's one. Secondly, there is another opportunity for us to build an inclusive civil society consensus on global governance reform. There's another opportunity for us to begin to build an effective global anti-poverty coalition, climate change coalition, and so on. For the first time, especially with opportunities within the US, there's an opportunity for us to build a truly global anti-war and anti-imperialist coalition. Anti-nuclear weapons, pro-human rights, and of course, a climate change leftist internationalist movement. So that's for us, as civil society, as activists on issues of Palestine and Western Sahara, in Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and so on, really to begin to engage that space. Because what we need to make sure really is that we build a broad constellation of forces across the globe, within the global south, linked with the global north, in particular, with opportunities that have now opened up, in the United States, with a very strong and vocal progressive left, a true progressive left, I might add, because as you would know, Abir, being a leftist in the US, at least pre-Bernie Sanders, wasn't the same thing as we would understand the leftist, today. So there is a true progressive left now that has emerged, and it gives us immense opportunities to begin to tackle these global issues.
Yes, no, that's really important to note, because as you're saying, all of these international shifts are happening at the moment, and this really is a moment to capitalize on. And even within the US, there has been a political shift, to the progressive left. And I think that's really important, even though, as you mentioned, Bernie Sanders is still not running. But, all of these people who are part of that movement and following him, I think are going to impact some of the political shifts domestically within the US.
No, absolutely. And that is why, you see, people don't understand the significance, of the Bernie Sanders movement. In that, whatever disappointments, people may have about Bernie the person, but there is a movement. You see, Bernie is not Bernie the individual. There is a movement behind Bernie, and that movement has vowed to continue. And I mean, what is even more interesting is if you look at US politics now, on matters of policy, about 75% of Americans agree with the progressive left on those issues. So that's quite a significant development in US politics.
Yes. No, thank you for that. And this has been a really, really wonderful analysis. I think you gave us some great historical background and a really good analysis of this moment that we're experiencing right now. I know we're going to wrap up soon, but I think I just want to hear any final words from you, Comrade Magama, coming from South Africa, being part of this Africa for Palestine movement and various other movements. What is kind of some final words or hopes for this future shift?
History has taught us that, struggles are hard, struggles are difficult. People lose their lives in the process of persecuting those noble objectives. But struggles eventually overcome. And so, to our brothers in Western Sahara and our sisters in Western Sahara, in Palestine, in Cuba, Venezuela, in Swaziland, and elsewhere, take heed from the experience of struggles before yours. And ultimately, there is no question that justice will always prevail in the final analysis, because it will take many of us to amplify the voice, to amplify the efforts, build those coalitions, build grassroots support, and take a moral position. I mean, I'm reminded by what Martin Luther King said, that the arc of the universe is always bent towards justice. And so, but to get there is a process. And we dare not, and neither do we have the luxury to let on now. The struggle of the people of Palestine, of Western Sahara, Venezuela, and elsewhere is our struggle. And it behoves us, those of us, who are in countries like South Africa in particular, but the African continent in general, which has immensely benefited from the support of people outside of our continental borders, to really take up the cudgel, and confront these brutal ethnic cleansers in Tel Aviv, and in Rabat, Morocco, in Washington and elsewhere, who support these repressive regimes, whilst of course, they preach human rights and equality on the other side of their mouths. It is our responsibility, and history will judge us very harshly if we let down, these people in their hour of need.
Yes, I think that's a really great message to end with, comrade. So thank you very much. It was really quite the honor to get to listen to you and be in conversation. And I think this gives us a lot to talk about, because we're all very caught up in this moment of COVID-19, personally, what this means for us, our life changes, etc. But it's really important that we also think about what does this moment mean to the oppressed peoples of the world, and how can we use this moment to unite and to shift power in a really important way. So thank you so much, comrade, for everything. For those of you who are listening in, like I said before, we're Africa for Palestine, and you can follow us on our social media. We're going to continue to put out talks like this on really important subjects. You can look forward to a talk on Friday about the plight of Christians in Palestine. We will have information about that. Friday is also Al-Quds Day, and so we'll have some programming. And I believe also, comrade, you're going to be part of some programming on Friday for Al-Quds Day. So please keep following us on social media. And I also want to announce we are selling face masks for Africa for Palestine. You can find them on our website, or you can find them on our social media. We all need to wear face masks. So if you're going to wear a face mask, you might as well have a really important symbol and message that you're conveying to others. So please, if you'd like to buy one or purchase one, you can check out our social media or our website, and all the proceeds go to Palestine Solidarity work. So thank you all. Have a good night, and we hope to see you soon.
Good evening.
Good evening.